You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports. I'm your host, Chad Jensen. With me, as always, my partner in crime. You know him, you love him, as your Denver Broncos reporter for 24/7 Sports. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, it's just coming through the wire. Beep, 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 beep. Chad Kelly, it's looking like he's got a new NFL home.
Yeah, I think his second chance is going to come in Indy this year, where the Colts are expected reportedly to sign Chad Kelly. That's the first interest that I've seen in him, Chad, since he's been released by the Broncos. And honestly, if he gets a second chance, it wouldn't be a great landing spot there behind Luck and Brissett. But I want to see him kind of stick with football. I've always liked him. I always rooted for him. And he made a dumb mistake, but he's hopefully learned from it. And he's working his way back in the NFL. So it's encouraging to see.
$1 million arm, nickel head.
If that.
He's such a talented quarterback. You know, his arm talent is just great. And I loved in his time at Ole Miss and with the Broncos, I loved his kind of moxie and his competitive drive and the way he could rally the troops. But the dude just can't. Character at bottom, you know, you drill all the way down, and really it all comes down to character. And Chad Kelly just lacks it. You know, it's unfortunate. Broncos moved on. They've got about 23 quarterbacks now on the roster, and we're going to talk about that. But yeah, Chad Kelly, he's got himself a new landing spot. And we're going to go through and react and break down the final day of the draft and just kind of our overall takeaways of the draft. We're going to talk about the college free agents the Broncos signed immediately following the draft. But first, just make sure you're following the show on Twitter, at HuddleUpPod. Best way to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the podcast in real time. Leave your creative review. Give us that 5-star rating on iTunes. All right, Zach, so let's talk about day 3. Now, we jumped on, we kind of hashed out between all the different podcasts that have dropped since, let's just say, Thursday evening. We've covered everything up until the beginning of round 4, in which the Broncos, of course, did not have a pick. They packaged that to move up to grab Drew Lock in round 2. But heading on into the day, they held 3 picks on day 3. They ended up dealing one of their 2 fifth-round picks to the San Francisco 49ers. And I want to talk about this first. To acquire edge rusher and special teams ace Dakota Watson. Now, most fans can remember that Watson was with the Broncos in a previous stint back in 2016. He arrived, he contributed on defense a little bit. Mostly he was a special teams ace for Gary Kubiak. And then he hit the bricks and signed a relatively lucrative contract for a backup with the San Francisco 49ers. But the Broncos gave up a 5th-round pick. And I have, obviously, my analysis on this. But what was your takeaway from that and your reaction?
When I saw it, I thought it was kind of super random that they would bring him back after 2 coaching regimes, you know, and I thought they would maybe want to look at their own players or draft a outside linebacker or depth for a special teams ace. But there's someone in that Broncos front office who's been there a while who's a big Dakota Watson fan. Maybe that's Elway, maybe that's a scout, but they obviously think he can help them in multiple areas, and he's a good body to have there. I personally like where the Broncos went in the draft to solve those positions of need. But Watson's always been a good player, and he should be good depth at the very minimum.
I just don't know how a journeyman backup edge rusher / special teams guy in what world is worth a 5th-round pick, especially going into a contract year. I mean, give up a 7th-round pick. Okay, I know they got a 6th round along with it, you know, so it's not that much skin off their teeth. They basically are dropping back around and losing a little bit of time in that value as well, going from a 2019 5th-round pick, giving that up to acquire Dakota Watson and a 2026 round pick. I know the value's not too far off, but I just didn't see. I mean, it would make more sense to me, Zach, if he was, you know, still had a couple of years left on a deal or something. But I just can't imagine how much of a true impact he's going to be able to make. Now, if I try and put on my rose-colored glasses and analyze this with the most optimism possible, and again, it's not that Watson's a bad player. He's not. He's just a high-quality depth backup, third-phase guy. But if I'm viewing this with the most optimism, Zach, it's that he's very versatile. You can put him on the edge. He's even got a lot of experience from earlier in his career playing off the ball. So maybe that's what the Broncos are thinking this time is, they weren't able to get that off-ball linebacker in the draft. We'll see what happens with Hollins. We'll talk about him here in just a minute. And so maybe they're thinking Watson can play some off-ball for him this time around.
Yeah, they gave up a lot for him, and that's why I said I think he has a big fan somewhere in the Broncos front office or the scouting department. And versatility is the name of the Broncos game, it seems, in this draft class. With Dalton Risner, he can play all over the line. Hollins is going to play inside and outside. So they like versatile players. And apparently maybe Fangio combed over his film. Maybe he got a recommendation, but they needed to fill that spot. And to me, like I said, it's just super random. A guy who was with the Broncos 3 years ago, Chad. I mean, bring back Corey Nelson, too, while we're at it. Yeah.
No doubt. Well, and it also just shows that connection that Elway continues to have with John Lynch over there in the front office in San Francisco, right, which is why we were kind of spitballing and speculating, and why you even asked the question to John Lynch yourself about a possible trade moving up from pick 10 to pick 2. But, of course, that did not happen, and here we are. So, I mean, ultimately, we'll get into these other two picks, but I was very unimpressed with Denver's day 3 maneuverings. I like Justin Hollins is like the only thing that really saves it for me. I mean, he was the pick they ended up making in the 5th round. Vic Fangio talked about him, having some visions for Hollins being able to play off the ball or the edge. They're going to try him at both places, see where he fits, see what makes most sense for the Broncos. But he's definitely an intriguing player. We've talked about him on the podcast before. You liked him a lot. I like the guy that played on the other side of the line from him, Jalen Jelks. But Hollins is here, and he's a really good player. I think you probably could have got him in the 6th round, but you got him in the 5th, and he could end up being one of those type of gems that Elway has a history of finding later in the draft, like a Malik Jackson, like a Danny Trevathan, a Matt Paradis, these type of players who are taken almost like a flyer without a second thought type thing that go on down the road. It usually takes a few years, but they end up paying dividends. It wouldn't surprise me if Hollins is one of those guys. But then, Zach, they trade away their 7th round pick and move up to reach. And that's what really, I hated that because it just smacks of the old Elway, right? It smacks of the things we've seen Elway do in the past, especially in the premium rounds. So, at least we can say it didn't happen until late in the draft. But I'm telling you, Juwan Winfrey, he's a solid receiver, but he probably would have gone undrafted, Zach. I mean, the Broncos had a really high grade on him, I think, comparatively around the league. Not too many teams were as high on him as the Denver Broncos, and they could have got him, I think, after the draft. Meanwhile, you had guys like Emmanuel Hall, who is Drew Lock's number 1 receiver, there on the board. And he ended up plummeting. And the Broncos did try to sign Hall for what it's worth. But he ended up choosing to go and play with the Chicago Bears. And I don't blame him, even though Lock's ended up in Denver, Zach, because the depth chart in Denver, I mean, it's a logjam, dude.
It is. And in terms of the Hollins pick, that has Fangio's fingerprints all over it, Chad. I like it a lot. I agree with you, though, that the day 3 was very underwhelming for me. And if there was a bad day of an overall great draft class, it was definitely Saturday. Hollins, to me, is more of a pass rusher than an inside linebacker. He's more of a Shane Ray replacement than a guy who's going to be pushing Todd Davis to start. So at outside linebacker, that's a great pick there. I thought they could have went another position, maybe got him a little later, but he is a good player. But the Winfrey selection, I mean, you had even Penny Hart on the board. You had other good, talented receivers, and you trade up and you use your last 2 draft picks for a guy who's Elway said there was getting some interest and they wanted to secure him, but still, I mean, it wasn't even that big of a need, Chad. It wasn't an immediate need. This is not a burner type. This is not a guy who's going to replace Emmanuel Sanders. This is a premium slot guy at the most. So I don't get that selection at all. And this actually reminded me of last year when I loved the draft up until the 6th and 7th rounds with Bierria and David Williams. And up until that point, it was great. But it's the same thing this year. I just don't understand why Elway would want to end on that note. I don't agree with it.
Right. But I will say this, as unimpressed as I was with day 3 for Elway and Matt Russell and company, it's not enough to take away from the absolute killing they made rounds 1 through 3. So
that's what matters.
And it is. You got to hit on those picks, and the Broncos were fortunate a little bit as well to have certain guys fall to them and have other teams make such bizarre decisions at the end of round 1, and not so much the top of round 2, but the end of round 1 really just threw the board off and allowed guys like Dalton Risner to slip, Drew Lock continued to plummet, and Elway, of course, packaged that deal to move up from 52 to 42 to grab him. And, that's just fortune smiling on John Elway. That's the football gods lifting their skirt and smiling down on John Elway and the Broncos because, in most football worlds, like we talked about on the previous podcast, most football universe, Daniel Jones does not go in pick 6 while Drew Lock goes at pick 42. And it's definitely a sign and a shot across Lock's bow. I hope he takes it seriously in terms of, I know he's an uber competitive guy. He gets pissed off if he loses a freaking ping pong game, kind of like his boss, John Elway. But he needs to humbly acknowledge that, look, there was a reason I fell. My footwork is atrocious at times. I need to, unify my feet with my upper torso and my arm and my eyes. And hopefully, he'll get the time to do that under the wing of a guy like Rich Gangarello. But at bottom, Zach, again, not enough. That day 3, we'll see what happens. I'll be surprised if Winfrey even makes the 53, right? But day 1 and 2, they were so good that I still have to give this draft an A.
Yeah, regardless of how day 3 turned out, obviously you and I would have liked the Broncos to go in a different direction. But getting Fan at 20, Reisner 41, and Lock at 42, whatever happened Saturday was immaterial. The Broncos killed the draft. It was an A, another home run for John Elway. So to get those premium players and to set yourself up for the short term and long term, it didn't matter what happened Saturday. Those were just extra picks. I feel like Elway kind of just said, I got the guys I wanted. I already won. I'm going to go take a chance now. I want Winfrey, whatever. I have nothing to lose now. That's the impression I honestly get.
Sounds like to me like maybe, day 1 was Thursday evening, Friday night, day 2, he hits the bar to celebrate how freaking lucky. Saturday wakes up in a haze. He's like, crap, where am I? And, the rest is history. Of course, I'm joking, but it was like, I think you're right. You kind of hit it there, kind of like resting on his laurels a little bit, right? From just crushing day 1 and 2. He's like, let's roll the dice on a couple of guys that, will fill a need with Watson, kind of, I guess. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what need Watson fills because you have now with the Hollins pick and with Holland, you have 2 depth rushers behind Von Miller and Bradley Chubb. I guess maybe if you went into this really projecting Watson to play off the ball, you're filling a need. But special teams, they have bodies, dude. They have guys who can run down and chase the ball. They have gunners. So I'm not sure. I mean, he's a great leader, and that's one thing that we'll take every day and twice on Sunday. Got to love leadership and intangibles, and that's something, at least, Zach, that Dakota Watson has in spades. But what did you make of Dave Gettleman, the GM of the Giants, claiming when he took some criticism for taking Daniel Jones at pick 6 when he probably could have got him at pick 17, his rationale publicly is that, well, the Broncos would have taken Jones at 10. If I wouldn't have taken him at pick 6, John Elway was taking Daniel Jones at 6. What was your thoughts on that?
I honestly think that Elway played Gettleman by leaking the interest in Daniel Jones to that extent, and that made them take Jones at 6 and drop Drew Lock down the board. I mean, the draft season is all about misinformation, deception, and fake news, and Elway's a veteran, and Gettleman has shown he's not the greatest GM in the world, and I think Elway played that pretty smart. I mean, there's no defending, in my book, taking Daniel Jones in a top 10 pick. As much as you like him, as much as the film stands out to you, you could have got him at 17. So they can blame the Broncos all they want. That was a pretty high reach for a quarterback like that.
And I concur. I think Elway played him, and it's kind of crazy because Gettleman, if you want to talk about, football guys, so to speak, or personnel guys with deep roots, I mean, Elway, of course, Hall of Fame player. If you want to talk about football guy, he's a football guy. But Gettleman's been a personnel guy a long time. He's been in a GM position at a couple different landing spots in the National Football League. So to see him get played like a fiddle by John Elway, and it worked. That's what's so beautiful about it, Zach, is that Drew Lock fell, and Elway was able to get him in the freaking second round, and it's killing him a couple, maybe more than 2 birds with one stone, because it's not only giving Lock the time to develop, but I think it's kind of countering some of his, I don't want to call it arrogance, maybe some of his conceit of where he was as a player, 4-year starter, being told to his face by John Elway, you're going to be a top 10 pick while he's at the Senior Bowl. So he's on cloud 9, and then he drops all the way to the second round. A little dose of humble pie. I think it can help a guy like Drew Lock because he really needs to focus on developing and smoothing out the rough edges on his technique especially. And that's why landing in Denver, there's a reason why he was so happy to come to Denver. It really is one of the best spots for him to land, not only because there's not any pressure on him to start out of the gates because of Flacco, but because he gets to work with Rich Scangarello, T.C. McCartney, and you could tell from some of the comments that Locke has made since the draft, some of the images and videos that have been published by the Denver Broncos on denverbroncos.com as Locke is hitting Dove Valley, on Saturday afternoon. You can tell that there was a connection forged between Locke and Rich Scangarello, and I'm really excited to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, it's there was also a connection with Elway. You can see that they had good chemistry, and Elway's face said it the best to me in his post-draft press conference, Chad. He knew he got his guys. He knew he won day 2, and he knew the rest of the draft was a wrap. And getting Locke, he was always his guy, and he wasn't going to take him at 10. He wasn't going to trade back up into the first round. But letting the board play out, I mean, the stars couldn't have aligned any better for John Elway and for Drew Lock. And he made that comment that he has a Pringles can, a king-size Pringles can on his shoulder. That's great for the Broncos. They need that alpha personality back in that room. Joe Flacco, he's more of a quieter type. I mean, he's not that fiery, that swag type that Drew Lock can be. Right. So it's a good counterbalance, and that's only going to help him. And if he can sit, and Elway mentioned having a Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers. I mean, you talk about having an Aaron Rodgers on the bench, sitting there, learning, developing, getting seasoned, being motivated. It can only help Denver going forward. So it's absolutely a win-win for both parties.
One thing I like, too, is what Dalton Reisner had to say at the podium when he was introduced on Saturday. And he's not a guy who strikes me, anyway, as being a dissembler. He's not going to put lipstick on the pig. He's going to either tell you how it is, or he's going to ignore the question type thing. And when he was asked about Drew Lock, he referred back to his time playing with Lock at the Senior Bowl and talked about how he commands a huddle, how he can rally guys, how guys respect him. And I think that's going to pay dividends for Lock in Denver. Like, for example, you rewind the tape a little bit, and Paxton Lynch hits the Broncos locker room. He had 0 friends. Like, he was there 3 full training camps. He was not able to make a single homeboy in the Broncos locker room. No one respected him. He didn't know how to connect with people. He wasn't a communicator. He wasn't a leader. And I don't think Drew Lock's going to have that problem. He's going to come to Denver, and he's going to settle in as a second-round pick. Again, the expectations are different. And I think he's a likable guy. Now, of course, this really sucks, but you had to hit that flight, Zach, on your way. When we were at the Combine, you had to leave a little bit earlier than me. So you didn't quite make the interpersonal stuff with Locke, but he's just a likable dude. Like, if you're standing next to him, you're talking to him, it's hard not to just go, okay, this guy's solid. And that's going to pay off in the locker room, so that when his time comes eventually, who knows, we'll see where that ends up being down the road. I think he's going to be starting a lot further on down the road than a Paxton Lynch, who's couldn't even say he was starting at square one. He's starting at like square -3 or 4, which is one of the reasons why, he hurts his ankle in that Raiders game, and he ends up on the bench crying. And I mean, he was just a mess. And I think in so many ways, Drew Lock is the antithesis of that.
He is. I mean, everything said about him is that he's easygoing and he's likable. I mean, he has an infectious personality. People are drawn to him. You can't teach that. Same reason why people love Baker Mayfield. Drew Lock killed his interviews at the Combine. He aced all of his pre-draft visits. Elway fell in love with him at the Senior Bowl, and it continued on over the course of several months. It's a perfect landing spot for him, and it's the Broncos finally have hope, and that's what I like. Regardless of how it turns out, regardless of how you feel about Flacco or Lock as the prospect, they have hope under center for the long term. And that, to me, is encouraging.
Yep, absolutely. We still have a lot to get to. We're going to go through the college free agents the Denver Broncos signed immediately following the draft. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, so let's talk about the undrafted free agents the Broncos signed immediately following the draft. And it's important to note, of course, that John Elway has a prolific record of finding not just impact quality, contributors in the undrafted ranks, but Pro Bowlers. He is the only GM since 2011 to sign 3 undrafted rookies who would go on to make the Pro Bowl. And of course, that's Chris Harris, that's C.J. Anderson, and Philip Lindsay. So when we go through this list of names, Now, granted, at this point, many of them, I'd be lying to you if I were to tell you I knew everything there is to know about these players the Broncos signed. I know enough to talk about most of it, but we don't know exactly what quality of players these are going to turn out to be for the Denver Broncos, but we do know that as an organization, Zach, these players are going to be given probably one of the best opportunities amongst the 32 NFL teams to earn a job and fight and make it to a 53-man roster. So let me run through these real quick. This is what we know as far as the signings as of the recording of this podcast. The first one, which made all the waves, you had an article on it, Brett Rippon, quarterback, Boise State. Now, it surprised me a little bit, not completely, that he tumbled all the way out of the draft. What were your thoughts on him going all the way? Him and Tyree Jackson, for what it's worth, tumbled out of the draft. But your thoughts on the Broncos grabbing Brett Rippon, and then we'll go through the rest of these.
I was more surprised that he fell out of the draft than Jackson. I thought he'd be a 5th or 6th round pick. So to get him as an undrafted free agent is good value. But how many different quarterbacks do you need? I mean, they have 5 on the roster right now.
Yeah.
I would assume this spells the end for Kevin Hogan and definitely Garrett Grayson. And definitely that quarterback room, though, Chad, that's intriguing now. Joe Flacco, Drew Lock, and Brett Rippon. Would you have taken that before the draft?
All day long.
I would have all day long. So, again, Elway's always lucking out with those undrafted free agents, and it's going to make some controversy. It's going to draw some headlines. Another backup quarterback position battle, but I like to pick up a lot. I was a big fan of his in the pre-draft process.
Yeah, one of these quarterbacks will not even make it to training camp, unfortunately, and I think it's probably going to be Garrett Grayson, the former Colorado State guy. You're going to see Flacco, Locke. You're going to see Kevin Hogan and Brett Rippon. All you need are 4 arms in camp. You need no more than 4 arms. So I think this, at least in the immediate future, Zach, spells certain doom for Garrett Grayson, and then it's going to come down to Rippon trying to unseat Kevin Hogan. And I agree with you that it probably spells doom for Hogan as well. But Brett Rippon, he's an interesting quarterback. He's very cerebral. He's maybe a less talented Jake Plummer, very similar, maybe not quite as athletic outside the pocket, but a lot of similarities there. Played at altitude, kind of at Boise State, and he's got a pedigree. He's got a lineage. His uncle Mark Rippon, of course, was a 2-time Super Bowl champion and a Super Bowl MVP. So he's an interesting player that, at worst, Zach, I look at this pickup as the type of thing that he comes in and gets groomed again by the great developer that is Rich Scangarello. And a year or two down the road, maybe the Broncos are able to flip him for some real draft capital.
Rippon, to me, is a high-end version of Trevor Siemian. And if the Broncos can get a high-end backup, a number 2 for the long term, as an undrafted free agent, that's a major win right there. I think they'll only keep 2 quarterbacks, though, on the 53 in the regular season. That's going to be Flacco and Locke. So either Rippon's going to be on the practice squad or released. I don't think, though, keeping Hogan offers any sort of long-term upside rather than keeping Locke and Rippon on the roster. So I would imagine that Hogan and Grayson are gone, and there's going to be a competition in camp for Rippon to push for that. If they keep 3, it would be him.
Yeah, definitely don't disagree there. The other college free agents the Broncos have signed up to this point include the following: George Aston, the fullback from Pittsburgh; Austin Fort, tight end, Wyoming; Kelvin McKnight, wide receiver, Samford; Trinity Benson, another wide receiver, East Central, from what I'm told is a speed demon; Brian Wallace, offensive lineman from Arkansas; John Leglu, offensive lineman from Tulane; Ahmad Gooden, defensive line, Samford; Jalen Johnson, defensive line, Washington; Joe Dineen, linebacker, Kansas; Josh Watson, linebacker, Colorado State, altitude guy; Malik Reed, linebacker, Nevada; Elijah Holder, cornerback, Stanford. Now, among the rest of these names, Zach, what really jump out to me is the name Joe Dineen, who is a frickin' tackling machine at Kansas. And maybe this is, if I'm looking at this right now, no, I know Rippon's the sexy name here because he's the quarterback that everyone expected to get drafted. And so the Broncos, fortunate once again. But Joe Dineen, to me, and Malik Reed, Zach, are the 2 names that jump out as the ones to watch in terms of highest potential to make the Broncos 53-man roster.
100% agree. Deneen actually has a chance. He's a natural off-ball linebacker. He's not a dynamic player, so he can compete there. He can push for reps there. And Malik Reed is my favorite undrafted pickup from this haul. This guy, if you watch his tape, Chad, I hadn't seen too much of him. I put on some tape of his yesterday. He explodes off the edge. I mean, he's a violent edge rusher, good bend, good speed to power. It's Broncos suddenly have competition now at edge rusher with Hollins, Dakota Watson. Now you have Malik Reed. This is only going to make this Broncos defense better. And it seemed like Elway ceded a lot of power to his coaching staff, and Fangio had his fingerprints all over these undrafted free agents. They're mostly defenders. So getting Malik Reed, that's my favorite pickup. I think he'll make the 53, and he'll actually get some sacks this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can look, I mean, as you go through this list, and there's an article, if you guys want to check it out on the website, milehighhuddle.com, that lists these names here with some analysis. But if you look at the names and the positions these players play, the Broncos tried to sign some depth pieces here, hedge against whatever they were unable to fully address in the draft. They tried to hedge against whatever weakness they might have coming out with these college free agent signings. So we'll see how it shakes out. Look forward to some more in-depth analysis on each one of these guys coming from us. I know Eric Trickle's working on an article to let our VIP subscribers and our great readers in on exactly which or what these guys bring to the table for the Denver Broncos. So look forward to that. But Zach, the one thing to keep in mind too, and as I was researching this article that I wrote on Saturday evening, this jumped out to me, and that is that now the 2018 numbers are not known as far as I've been able to research, but in 2017 alone, there were more undrafted rookies or former undrafted rookies playing 40% of their team's snaps in the NFL than first-round picks. Okay, so think about that. If you're an undrafted rookie, I mean, and then you look at the Denver Broncos' history and record of having, I think in the last 14 years, 15 years, whatever it is now, only 1 year did they not have an undrafted rookie make the 53-man roster. If your name didn't get called on draft day and the phone rings and it's Denver, that's my first place that I want to land, because I know I'm going to be given a true opportunity to earn a spot as opposed to just being a camp fodder,
Nobody kills the 8th round better than John Elway. It's just fact. It's just historically that's been the case. And actually, Malik Reed, he was going to sign with the Jets, Chad. He had an offer, but he pulled that and signed with the Broncos. Why? Because they're the best team to sign with. They know the history there. They know Chris Harris Jr., C.J. Anderson. So Philip Lindsay, obviously last year, it's encouraging. And then Elway, that's why we knew he was going to kill the 8th round. But to have those first and second round shakeout, I mean, it's super optimistic right now for me.
Yep. I think overall, I mean, just looking at this complete body of work coming out of the draft or draft weekend, from the picks to the college free agent signings, I mean, there's a couple of disappointments, which we've already addressed, but overall, I still have to give this, as a complete body of work, an A grade, Zach, because the Broncos, not only did they get some immediate impact players, but they also hedged for the future with guys like Drew Lock. I'm so excited to see what Dalton Reisner can bring, not just as an individual, but his leadership. A guy like him has the ability and potential to elevate an entire offensive line, because his intangibles are that off the charts. And then you throw in the factor of Mike Munchak, Chris Cooper. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this offensive line shapes up. And a lot of it will be determined by the health and availability, of course, of Ronald Leary, who's coming off that Achilles injury. But worst case scenario, Zach, I see the offensive line shaking out like this. This is worst case. Garrett Bowles, Sam Jones, left guard, Connor McGovern, center, Dalton Reisner, right guard, and Jawan James at right tackle, which, if you look at where the Broncos were before the injury started decimating them halfway through last season, even with the loss of Matt Paradis, I think that's a massive upgrade.
I mean, I've said it on Twitter a few times, and I'll say it again. It's a top 10 offensive line if they stay healthy. It's a big if, of course, but between Mike Munchak and the talent they have there, Chad, and the resources they've dumped into the O-line, it's a top 10 O-line. But in terms of the draft class as a whole, I don't know that you look at this without giving it an A. And what you also have to consider, they picked up a 2020 third-round draft pick on top of everything else.
Good point.
And also didn't draft a corner, so maybe you add even Chris Harris Jr. to that haul. Yeah. When you look at it like that, you keep all those pieces in place. You get a potential future of your franchise at quarterback, instant day one starters, long-term sustainability. It's it's impossible to dislike this draft haul, Chad. It's impossible to deny that Elway has turned a corner as a GM, and he's actually a pretty damn good drafter now.
Yeah, I can't disagree. And since you brought him up, let's talk about it real quick before we get out of here. Chris Harris Jr., of course, John Elway claimed that he did not get any additional phone calls with regard to interest on the trading block for Chris Harris, and his tonality really softened post-draft. Like, I guess he's a man of his word, right? He said, look, I'll address that after the draft, blah, blah, blah. He threw in that little disclaimer, but that doesn't mean that anything's going to happen, that whole thing, which is what caused the you-know-what storm to take place. But here's what he said over the weekend, quote, "No, I did not hear from anybody about Chris today regarding trades. And as I said the last 3 times, when the draft is over, I'll be glad to talk to Chris and see what we can do," close quote, which is a significant softening, Zach, of his kind of militant stance early on last week.
Well, so much of that on both sides, Chad, was posturing. So much of it was negotiating through the press, and it's just the standard way business goes about it in the NFL. I think a lot of Elway, his alleviation stemmed from the draft class. I think he nailed it, so he was a little bit optimistic or lighter in that press conference. I just saw it on his face, and he wants to get something done with Chris Harris Jr. Maybe his agent lowered his demand. Maybe they made some progress. We don't know just yet. But the fact that they didn't take a corner in the draft says they're either really comfortable with the corners they have now, or they're hopeful to get something done with Chris Harris Jr. I can only hope it's the latter.
Yeah, and I think a deal will get done. The question now is, how much wiggle room will Chris Harris really give him? Because the only fly in the ointment I could see is if he literally sticks to his guns on that $15 million number. Because even though I'll be the first one to say, he's worth it, I can see how Elway would have a hard time biting that type of a bullet when he's also paying a $25 million a year max contract to Von Miller. So if Harris can come to the table and say, look, I want to be compensated for my contributions and also what I bring to the table for the next 3 years, and I'm willing to take, if you make the guaranteed money and the signing bonus fat enough, I'm willing to take, 13 or 13.5 to stick around.
Yeah, and also it's worth keeping in mind that the Broncos dropped down from 10 to 20, so they're going to pay a little less for that first-round draft pick, and every penny towards this counts for the Broncos. They don't have a lot of cap space, and his next contract will be big. I don't think he'll get 15. I think, like you said, 13, maybe 13.5 at the most is likely, and that's a fair deal. And that's fair for both sides after the Broncos invested so much money in Callahan and Kareem Jackson. And he deserves to get paid. And I thought he'd get traded during this draft. I'm not going to lie. And the fact that he had a soft tone, as you said, and they didn't make a trade, I think it's hopeful now.
So keep your chins up, Broncos country. You just had a phenomenal draft, and it's looking like things are looking up anyway for Chris Harris returning, or sticking it, I should say, with the Denver Broncos. But that's going to do it for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast. We are putting out a thread today. We're recording this Sunday, so look for this. For Tuesday's episode, we're going to do a VIP mailbag because we weren't able to do it on this last. The way the draft shook out and the timing and everything, we just weren't able to get to it. But I put a thread in the MHH Insiders Forum, so VIPs, whatever questions are on your mind coming out of the draft, go there, leave your questions, and Zach and I will address them on tomorrow's show. We'll see what else comes out on Monday as far as the news and things that take place, and I'm sure we'll want to talk about that too. But in the meantime, make sure you are following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. Don't forget to leave your creative review and rate us on iTunes. You can find my partner, Zack Kelberman, on Twitter at Kelberman247, myself at Chad and Jensen. Chin up. I hope you guys are celebrating. I hope you had a great weekend because your Denver Broncos just crushed the draft. And all we can do is, based on the free agent moves and the coaching additions as well, is hope that this is all great harbinger of what's to come for the Broncos in 2019 and beyond. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you soon.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.